With all the other bullshit going on around the place, you were just like, it was nice to see. Oh, you did move. Oh, right. Oh, yeah. Hmm? Yeah, yeah. I have a few.
You will have to. I think the first part is just you have to write to the committee because you have to go first with the national bodies. Then, if you have a regional body,
I call the university. A couple of cancelled.
national one for some reason your heads confused or didn't go well, or for some reason
That out Twitter.
Is
stampede.
or there is a possibility that there is some kind of safe for you to
IWD event, Violence Against Women and Girls and the Sustainable Development Goals, Accelerating Efforts to Achieve the 2030 Agenda. I'm sure you've all had time to have a look, well it's down now, but at the safety message, so just to keep that in mind during the event. Okay, so this event draws together voices from academic, business and women's organisations to reflect on the efforts needed to achieve gender equality. And first of all, we have a message from the President, who had planned to be here but unfortunately couldn't make it.
So welcome to NUI Galway, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome you to our event this evening, hosted by the NUI Galway Centre for Global Women's Studies on the elimination of violence against women and girls. Particularly sad that I can't be there, so apologies I can't be there with you this evening, but I wanted to send you this message to support the work that's being done and to signal the importance of it for both for the university and our community more widely. A number of aspects to it. First of all, as you may know, we have launched our strategy this year, which is based on values and grounded in values which are really important to us as a university community, and the greatest of these values being respect. And clearly in this work there is respect for women and girls, respect for society more generally, that is ingrained in this work, and that is a very, very profound part of it. Secondly, as part of that, we also signed up as a university to the Sustainable Development Goals, and clearly in this case Goal 5 and 5.2 are very much at the heart of this work, and this work of our colleagues contributes to NUI Galway's leadership in that regard. And then thirdly, I think very important to say that this is important work, and protection of women and girls from violence is really important clearly for women and girls themselves and for nurturing all the talents in society. And by doing that, it's important also for the organisations, for the families, for society in which these women and girls work and live and contribute. And I think the work that's shown here and that's being highlighted here makes that very important point, that there is a loss of productivity, a loss of well-being in society to violence against women and girls. So not only it is important to call it out for dignity and for respect, but it is also important to call it out for the well-being of society more generally, the well-being of the organisations in which take part in this work, and the well-being of families and society more generally. So it's a very important work, not only for the women and girls involved, and that's in itself very profound, but also important work for the well-being of society more generally and for making the world a better place, which ultimately is the responsibility of us all, that we leave the world in a better place than we found it. So, Tracy live as an obair tarsúlaguh, tá brona marísh nach bhfuil mé an bheith live, but this is really important work, and as President of NUI Galway, I'd like to send this message to support the work being done, to thank Nata and our colleagues in the NUI Galway Centre for Global Women's Studies, and to thank all of those who, as part of our values of respect, part of our values of openness and working with others in the community, part of our values of excellence in how we go about our work, and finally part of our values in sustaining organisations, sustaining the well-being of society, but most important, respecting and sustaining the dignity of other human beings. I'd like to commend the work and signal the importance of it for the university and our university community. Thank you. So welcome to NUI Galway, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome you to our...
Okay. So first of all, we're going to have some presentations from the team working on the DFID funded project on the economic and social costs of violence against women and girls. So first up, we will have Dr. Nata Davory, who is the Director for the Centre for Global Women's Studies, also the PI for the DFID funded project, and the PI for the economic costing study conducted in Ireland. Then we will have Dr. Srinivas Raghavendra, a macroeconomist and lecturer in the J.E. Kearns School of Business and Economics, and also the co-principal investigator for the DFID project. Then we will have Dr. Stacey Shriver, lecturer in the School of Political Science and Sociology, and also the director for the MA in Women's Studies, and the coordinator for the DFID project. And Stacey will be followed by Miss Lindsay Block, who is the Ethical Trade Controller at Primark head office in London. She has worked at Primark for over 6 years in the Ethical Trade and Environmental Sustainability team. Her role is vast and diverse, and her day-to-day involves supporting improved conditions for workers across our global supply chain. And then finally, we will have Miss Katrina Gleeson, who is the Programme and Communications Manager with Safe Ireland and also the Safe Ireland Coordinator for the Irish Costing Study. Thank you.
So first of all, on behalf of the Centre for Global Women's Studies, I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm really delighted that so many of you have come in a very cold, wet day in Ireland, as usual. I think the research that we have done actually takes on a particularly important dimension in today's context of coronavirus. Coronavirus is a health problem, which WHO has now just declared a pandemic. And one of the most important aspects of this health problem that is being discussed, which is moving policymakers to immediate action, is actually the productivity impacts, the economic costs of this virus. And it points to the importance of understanding the ramifications of any kind of social problem. Violence against women is one of those pandemics which is often not recognized as a pandemic, which is often neglected on the side because policymakers feel happy to say that it is a fundamental rights violation and stop right there. That yes, we have recognized it's a rights violation, but that it has actually systematic ramifications for society and for economy is not recognized. And that is what we had hoped to do with this research, is to bring recognition to these economic and social impacts of violence against women, which have significant ramifications for economy and society. And it's invisible, and we need to pay attention to this invisible, daily, ongoing impact that violence has for all countries across the globe. So the aim of the research was particularly to try and empirically establish the cost of inaction for women, families, businesses, communities, and country. This cost of inaction is significant, and it needs to be recognized. We included both economic costs and social costs. Economic costs included the standard out-of-pocket expenditures, foregone income, missed care work, missed days of school for children, as well as productivity loss, which we will show to you is a very significant dimension of the economic cost of violence against women and girls. But we also looked at the social costs, and these are not easily monetizable. They're not monetary estimates that we can make, but they are significant in the sense that they affect the well-being of families, communities, and societies. The kinds of social costs that we looked at and explored was health, the impacts on health, on well-being, on relationships, intergenerational impacts, and so on, and community cohesion, which Stacey will be talking about. In this study is unique in the sense that we did not limit the study to intimate partner violence. We explored the different experiences of violence that women experience in their daily life, starting from intimate partner violence to violence within the home, to violence at workplace, to violence in education institutions, and to violence in public spaces. So we have tried to estimate the impacts of these different forms of violence that women experience. The study was undertaken in Ghana, Pakistan, and South Sudan, as identified in the global map. And these three countries represent different contexts in terms of stability, fragility, and conflict. The study used a mixed methods approach, so we had quantitative surveys with households and women, as well as, for the first time, business employees in businesses, men and women, and managers. We also had qualitative research in Ghana and Pakistan within communities, interviewing both women who experienced and did not experience violence, as well as key informants. The estimation of cost was based on the quantitative surveys and were scaled to regional or national level. So we tried to estimate national costs. The samples then included about 3,000 women and households in Pakistan and 2,000 women and households in South Sudan and Ghana, respectively. In terms of the qualitative research, we had in-depth interviews, we had participatory focus group discussions, we had key informant interviews, all coming to about more than 900 participants across the three countries. The business surveys were done with 100 businesses in each country, and we had 500 plus employees interviewed within each country. So the size of the sample is fairly large. It's not based on 5 or 10 people. One of the most important findings of this study is really demonstrating, once again, the very high levels of violence that women experience across the globe, and particularly in the developing countries that we studied. Often the figure that is cited is 1 in 3 women has experienced physical and/or sexual violence in her lifetime. But what we explored was the violence in the last 12 months, which is often thought to be much less. It's a lot fewer women will experience violence in the last 12 months. But what we see is that there are really significantly high levels of violence that these women are experiencing in the last 12 months. So in Ghana, any violence, that is any physical, sexual, and/or psychological violence, 43% of women in Ghana experience such violence in the last 12 months. Not unsurprisingly, in South Sudan, which is in the context of conflict, was much higher, almost nearly double of the levels in Ghana. What is also interesting is that there's been a lot of focus on intimate partner violence, but there is equally experiences of violence by non-partners, either family members or colleagues, friends, acquaintances, or strangers in the public space. So if we combine both the experience of intimate partner violence and non-partner violence, we see that there are very high levels of violence that are experienced by women in Pakistan. It's 34% of women in Pakistan experienced any form of violence in the last 12 months. And in South Sudan, it is 83%. We found equally high levels of violence being experienced by employees in businesses. This is important to understand because we often have an assumption that women who are working then are less likely to experience violence. And our survey showed that actually women who are working do have fairly high levels of violence. So if we look at the percentage of female employees who experienced intimate partner violence and/or non-partner sexual violence, 38% in Ghana experienced violence and 60% in South Sudan experienced such violence. These are fairly high levels of violence experienced by employees in businesses. And so this is why we also looked at the cost to businesses. Before I present some of the macro estimates and my colleagues further develop those macro estimates, we want to first share with you the voices of women, the stories of women that we heard in this survey, and their daily experience of violence and the impacts as they have unfolded in their lives. So, is he gone? Okay. Sorry for the technical delay. Okay. Sorry for the human delay.
The human delay. So this is there.
But how do we switch
Oh, yeah,
it?
sorry. Yeah, that's here.
Violence against women is a global problem. 1 in 3 women experience violence by a husband or partner, or sexual violence by a non-partner worldwide. Women experience violence across all regions. They often experience physical, sexual, or psychological violence, including stalking, often simultaneously. The patriarchal mindset dismisses violence against women as a private matter. The psychological harm it causes is often hidden and is transmitted from one generation to the next. Violence against women is a human rights violation. In addition to intimate partner violence, women experience violence by family members, work colleagues, teachers, peers, and strangers in public spaces.
Whatever about physical abuse, I think emotional, verbal abuse, people don't really know. Is it real? As horrible as it is, every now and then I wish he had hit me, because it would be proof and something that maybe he would have to acknowledge.
Violence against women has numerous adverse health impacts. Women experiencing violence are at a higher risk of miscarriage or stillbirth and more pain. They are also more vulnerable psychologically.
You don't even see it. It's like a disease that just creeps up and just bites you, and all of a sudden you have it. You can't believe that it's happened so quickly. My sense of me was what was attacked. And it was done so gradually that it wasn't just like a big kind of smack. It was done over such a length of time that by the end of it all, you were like, maybe I am, you know, maybe I am. And by the end of it, like, you doubt everything that you hold dear.
Violence against women leads to significant costs on households, businesses, and the economy.
Women in our community want to earn to supplement their family income, but their men don't allow them. If a woman is allowed to earn, other men in the community accuse her of being involved in some suspicious activities. And if any unmarried women work, then the community blames her of having a bad character. Men have the perception that women going out will change our tradition and moralities, and that we do not want.
I'd been really looking for a job. But you not only need the experience, you need the right state of mind. So I'd obviously been keeping loads of job announcements, and he was telling me that I'm not good enough, I'm useless, I can't do anything, and I'm very bad and no one would be happy with me. That was quite a distressing moment in my life. I couldn't find a job for a long time.
Women's economic opportunities are inextricably linked to the consequences of violence, particularly violence within the home. Women experiencing domestic violence are more likely to have a chronic physical or psychological health condition, such as depression. These health impacts diminish women's economic opportunities and capabilities. Violence creates a vicious cycle. By negatively affecting women's labour force participation and education or skill development, it impedes women's economic empowerment and status in society, which in turn exacerbates violence.
My husband was suspicious of me. He used to hit me. My brothers-in-law also doubted me. They would say that I should be killed. My mother also didn't support me, even though she married me off to a person that was 15 years older than me.
Studies show that children growing up in violent households are at a greater risk of suffering from cognitive difficulties, lower educational performance, and increased juvenile delinquency. Another important dimension that is unrecognised is the impact of trauma on the unpaid care work that women do, and its impact on children.
The children become violators themselves. The boys learn and assume that it is normal to abuse their partners. The girls also tend to believe that it is okay to be abused by your partner, so the cycle continues.
My children and I remain upset because of my husband's aggressive attitude. It negatively impacts the children as they get scared. We all live in an environment of fear. Because of this, children think of killing themselves, either by taking poison or by a car accident.
The cumulative impact of violence over time impedes skill formation, which can constrain the human capital potential and empowerment of women.
For me, if I am a leader and such a thing happens to me, I may decide to step down. People will gossip about me. If I have been given a position and such a thing happens to me, I may feel shy and step down. I may say that I would like to hand over power to this or that person.
The invisible harm of violence against women has a long-lasting impact that goes beyond the individual. And the longer the issue of violence against women is dismissed as an individual family matter, the larger the invisible harm for society will be.
Why do we not get justice? Where do we go, and to whom do we say our grief? There is need to change the perception and mindset of people.
This research is helping to give visibility to an often invisible problem. The UK Department for International Development has invested in a global programme to identify solutions to prevent violence against women. Safe Ireland has launched campaigns such as the Man Up campaign to shift norms and attitudes. More still needs to be done by governments, businesses and communities to accelerate efforts to eliminate violence against women.
So the video really powerfully tells us the kind of impacts that women experience on a daily basis. And the most important is how the capability of women is undermined. Women talked a lot about the inability to do care work, which is one type of work that is often not recognized. It's another silent, unpaid work that women do. But due to violence, women reported that they missed nearly 50 days in South Sudan, 24 days in Pakistan, and this amounted to 11 million days in Pakistan. This size of unpaid care work that is being not done has a significant impact on children. And this flows into this intergenerational impacts that many of the women talked about. But there is not only this unpaid care work, this most significant cost that we found was really about the productivity impact, both for women who are employed in businesses as well as women who are in households doing self-employment or small subsistence activities. When women experience violence, they also incur expenditures for mitigating the effects of violence. That is, seeking medical assistance, seeking legal assistance, and often replacing the property, the furniture, the utensils, the consumer items that are destroyed in the course of violence. And in Ghana, what we found is that women spent US $53 on average, which amounted to a whopping 18 million US dollars in a year that women had to spend to mitigate the effects of violence. The other important aspect or dimension that we found in our study is the impact on businesses. What we found through the employee survey is that female employees experiencing violence are less likely to be productive. An interesting finding that we had is that it not only affects the women who experience violence, but equally affects the men who perpetrate violence. That men who perpetrate violence also have a productivity loss, which manifests itself at the workplace. Along with the male perpetrators are also bystanders and colleagues are also affected by the violence that women are experiencing. And even in conflict-affected contexts and among more educated people, violence against women impacts on women and businesses. Irrespective of the country context, this impact is universal. So for example, in Ghana, what we found is that women employees missed 102 hours or about 13 days due to the violence that they were experiencing at home. They were late by half a day, and they had around 5 days of low productivity, or what we call presenteeism, that they were not productive while at work. Similarly, in Pakistan, women missed 17 days in the last year and had 2 days of low productivity. And in South Sudan, we found that the productivity loss by employees, female employees who are experiencing violence, by the male perpetrators, by the colleagues, all amounted to about 12,000 days in the last year, which was equivalent to 3 days per employee who was employed in the 100 businesses that we surveyed. So you see that the productivity loss due to violence at home is quite significant and has an impact on businesses. From the household survey, we found equally high levels of productivity impact. In Ghana, on average, women missed 15 days of work, or whether it is paid or unpaid, of economic activity. And there were 11 days in which they had presenteeism or low productivity. So the total productivity loss for women came to 26 days in the last year. And similarly in Ghana, in South Sudan, it was 16.6 or 17 days of productivity loss. To understand the significance of this productivity loss, think of today's discourse that people going into self-isolation for 14 days is causing such a panic. That really means a significant decline in productivity in the economy. This is a yearly productivity loss that is happening due to violence alone in economies all over the world, and it has been continuing for many years on. The total productivity impact, if you take, in Ghana, amounted to, the national estimate amounted to 65 million days. And the 65 million days was equivalent to 4.5% of employed women not working. That is, your production loss was the output produced by 4.5% of women who were employed. So this is quite significant, and it's this kind of loss that can potentially have an impact on policymakers to move beyond their comfortable rhetoric that violence is a rights violation and move to action to begin to invest resources to address violence.
Thank you. So you can clearly see that the kind of impacts, the productivity impacts that violence has, is not just kind of within the four walls of the house, and it has significant impact to businesses and so on. It has much further ramification to the whole economy. Let me put it this way: you might ask me, why do you even bother? It is a rights violation, period, Okay, why do you even bother about the costs of violence, costs due to violence to businesses and a household? We have to see this in a context of economic policy making. When in a kind of economic management that happens in all over the world, in the current economic management, it is the economic policy, the economic argument is what is being completely dominant over any other argument, irrespective of whether social, all kinds of other arguments. It's an economic argument that actually weighs in terms of policy making and resource allocation. So we really wanted to see what is the implication for, rising from this productivity loss that might look like a local, individual level, individual household level, individual business level productivity loss. What is the implication for the overall economy? Because after all, economy is an interconnected network of all sectors. So that's what we tried to do in this research, that we go down. We looked at how individual losses at the micro level, household and the business level, creates this ripple effect into the overall economy. We essentially showed that for every dollar lost, in the households due to violence, additional 57 cents were lost in the economy due to this interlinkages between various business sectors. Every sector is interlinked, right? Hotel sector is interlinked with tourism. Tourism is interlinked with hospitality sector, and so on and so forth. So every dollar that is lost within the household, you lose an additional 57 cents in terms of loss in the economy. So if you combine these two together, the total loss to the overall economy is about 1% of GDP. In this current situation of coronavirus, there are two scenarios that came about in the last week, that economy will lose 0.5 to 1.5% of GDP in the coronavirus. Compare that with this figure. This is 1% of GDP year on year. It's a permanent loss that is accumulating over time. Okay. Now we also looked at how business sectors themselves get affected. Various business sectors: food processing, manufacturing, utilities, construction, other services, which is a macro aggregate sector of all retails, transportation, information communication, and all kinds of service sectors. So there is a significant loss to business sectors arising from this productivity loss due to violence. And also implication of that income loss is translated into tax loss for governments. They lose about 0.5% of total revenues from sales tax from various sectors. So you can also flip this and say, instead of loss, you can see this as a potential income that the government could have actually gained, is about 0.5% of the total revenues. They could have gained if there was no violence. Now, we also looked at, and this loss, mind you, this loss is happening at the existing level of service provision in the economy, existing level of support to survivors of violence. In spite of this existing level of support, you find this loss that is, or what we call as leakage from the economy, that is happening for about 1% of GDP. And this is a permanent loss. And this is not, you don't recoup this loss in the economy. And it is a permanent loss that occurs year on year over a period of time. And this is the potential income that the economy could have earned if there was no violence. And and this is happening in spite of existing support provision for survivors of violence. And this is what we call as cost of inaction. If you do nothing, if you maintain the status quo, and this is the loss that you incur in the economy, and this is a permanent loss, year on year loss, and the economy could have actually gained this much amount if there was no violence, and this is what we call as potential growth that could have gained by the economy in the absence of violence. And what is the actual growth that the economy is growing is shown in this graph. And if you looked at over a period of time, for 10 years period or 15-year period, and this permanent, invisible loss is about 8% of overall, from 2010, in this case 2010 to 2014, 8% of total GDP in this period. That is the cumulative loss that is due to violence over a period of time. And this is permanent, yet invisible loss that goes out to the economy. So in the context of sustainable development, where economic policy making is seen as the prime lever to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, this is an important way to look at economic policy making. To say that the economic policymakers, that investing in service provision, investing in mitigating violence, investing in preventing violence, can actually gain 1% of GDP, 1% of GDP that you otherwise would not have got. So you could have actually earned potential GDP in the economy. And this is what we are trying to show in this piece of research, to say that the economic policymakers need to take into account the important aspect of violence against women into their consideration when they actually form decisions on resource allocation. After all, it is the lever now at this point in time to implement the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. And I'll stop here and leave to Stacey.
Okay, thank you very much. So what we want to do now is to have a little bit of a look at what are some of the social impacts that we see as a result of violence against women and girls. So when we watched the video, we were given a bit of a snapshot of the range of different kinds of impacts that individuals and their families also experience. So we know that there are clear impacts on health, both physical health as well as psychological well-being. We've learned that there are impacts on productivity, both in terms of paid work and unpaid work, as well as, very importantly, care work as well. But violence against women and girls also has additional impacts, including on things such as our self-esteem and our sense of agency. It impacts on our ability to form and maintain relationships with others as well. And it also impacts on our household income, which reduces the inputs that we require in order to be able to enact different kinds of choices and decisions in our own lives. Now, these effects of violence that we see at the micro level also ripple out to the economy, as was just presented, but also to broader society as well. And the kinds of impacts that we see here, they compromise all of society because they reduce capabilities, they threaten social networks, and they limit equitable social cohesion as well. So in the next couple of slides, what we're going to do is just take a brief look at some of the different findings that we've seen that relate to the impacts that occur that affect society more broadly, so that ripple out towards a broader impact than just individuals and families. One of the things that we found is that violence against women and girls has an effect on people's sense of safety. And that's not only on individuals' sense of safety in terms of how they feel about their own well-being, their own safety in their home or when they're out for a night, but actually it changes how they feel within the community as a whole. And it changes how others in the community feel as well. So violence against women and girls doesn't only impact on those who are victims or survivors, but it can affect others as well who are not direct victims. So these indirect victims might be family or friends, or they might be simply people in the community who have read the newspapers and who suddenly feel that their own sense of safety might be compromised as well. And even when we look at something like intimate partner violence, this is often seen as being a private issue. But actually, the way that perpetrators are often seen may be as being unsafe men. Where there is impunity, where those men identified as being unsafe because of their actions towards women and girls are still in the community and at large, that actually increases that sense of fear again. As a result of this, what we see is that women and girls start to change their behavior. And that is not just direct victims, but others as well. So that they may, for instance, reduce going out after dark. They may not take public transport by themselves. They may make sure that they have somebody to accompany them to the marketplace. But all of these changes to their behavior acts as constraints on their freedom and their agency. Furthermore, others might start to see the community as a whole as being in some way troubled. That may result in the community being seen as being unworthy, for instance, of investment or of further efforts in order to improve the situation. And so we see in this small quote here that the area where there is violence against women and girls will get a bad reputation. There will always be fear and panic. And so these impacts are beyond just that individual who experiences the violence, but affects a much broader group within society. Another impact is around social cohesion. Now, we know that shame and stigma are very common outcomes or associated with experiences of violence. We saw already that women can often change their behavior in order to try and reduce risk, for instance. But what we also see is that women will change their behavior in anticipation of the potential stigma that will be brought against them by other members of the community. So one woman explains that I become shy and will not go to public. I could not speak in public. It had a serious effect on me. We see that this anticipation of others' negative reactions towards those who disclose experiencing violence leads women to reduce involvement in a number of different spaces. So this was true in terms of their work. It was true in terms of attending religious services, about going to marketplace, and of social events. We also see that this goes beyond simply the woman's engagement within society, but also can result in the entire family being stigmatized or excluded. And so this might be, for instance, in intimate partner violence, where a family is known to have violence within the family, that there will be a level of social containment, right? To exclude that family from the larger social grouping in order to reduce any negative impact on others. It can also happen in cases of sexual violence by a non-partner, where the entire family will experience a level of shame being directed towards them because of the violence that the woman in their family group experienced. And this kind of shame and stigma can lead the families to be excluded from involvement in community groups and activities. But this isolation and exclusion itself can compound other kinds of negative impacts of violence. It will probably mean that that woman has less access to support services. She may be unwilling to reach out for help, to disclose her experiences for fear of how it will also impact on the rest of her family. And overall, what this does is that it actually reduces social cohesion, because different groups of people are seen as belonging in different kinds of spaces. And so this exclusion of certain families, of certain groupings of people, actually undermines the level of social cohesion that is required for equitable growth. One of the other areas that we found emerged through our interviews and focus group discussions that we hadn't necessarily anticipated was actually the impact on women's leadership itself. So, we know already from what we just discussed that fears of anticipated stigma could result in women reducing their engagement with others. But what we also saw was that the same kind of fear, this concern about gossip, about being embarrassed in front of others, or feeling that people have less respect for you, meant that women were excluded from taking on leadership group roles within their community, or would exclude themselves from taking on those leadership roles. So as we see in this first quote here, people will have less respect for you as a leader. They will not value what you say. If such a woman who has experienced violence is a church elder, people will not listen to what she preaches. Below, we see something very similar. If, for instance, she was a fellowship leader in the church or community, it will not give her the moral right to advise people, and she will feel that she has failed at home, and so she is not in the position of getting any form of advice. So what we're seeing here is that it is not only anticipated stigma, but that there is a level of social blame that is associated with those who experience violence. And that social blame also connects this idea of lacking wisdom, that you entered into a relationship where there was violence, and that must be your fault for not having anticipated that that would occur. And because you're seen as having failed in that respect, it also means that your judgment becomes questionable across a number of different areas, including within your leadership position. And we do know that one participant explicitly discussed the fact that she did not disclose the violence that she was experiencing, that she did not look for help for the violence she was experiencing, because she wanted to maintain her leadership role. So, in order to maintain that role, she did not seek any kind of help. And what this is again telling us is that this level of stigma that is directed towards women because of the violence that they experience, the blaming that occurs, actually is impacting on women's roles within the community. And that's not a loss only for those individual women, but it's a loss for all of us when we lack the inputs that are needed by everyone in society. And so we see that there are these very broad impacts to society. The evidence suggests that in communities where violence against women and girls is common, it has a chilling effect on women's and girls' mobility and leadership. That in fact, it has an impact on their capabilities itself. This undermines not only women's, but also the whole of communities' potential. And so when we talk about addressing violence against women and girls, we need to see that addressing this actually has very far-reaching implications. It is essential to address it for individuals and for families, but it's not only them that experiences the benefit of us doing something to address it. Because ultimately, it's actually about the functioning of vibrant, productive, and equitable communities. So I wanted to just briefly discuss some of the kind of key conclusions and recommendations that have come out of this project. So from these main conclusions from our study, what our study has demonstrated is that violence that is experienced by women, it does have a significant economic consequence for women, for households, for communities and businesses, and for the overall economy. We see that there is a ripple effect of violence against women that occurs outside of the workplace that affects the productivity of all employees inside the workplace, and that's both men and women. We also see that the well-being of women and their families is affected, and that is particularly because women are oftentimes unable to do the care work that they normally would do as a result of the violence that they experience. And this also has implications for the future, because the children of women who are experiencing violence also experience impacts due to that violence. And that can result in losses to their capabilities into the future. Now, drawing from the findings of this study, we have made certain policy recommendations. And the publications that you guys hopefully have accessed on your way and give you some more information about some of these recommendations in more detail. But we do have some that we wanted to highlight here. So these include the importance of integrating knowledge of the costs of violence against women and girls into social and economic policy making. Because as we've seen, ignoring this issue results in ongoing significant losses that affect all of us. We also want to point towards the fact that there is a role for many different types of stakeholders and duty bearers in terms of addressing violence against women and girls. Governments, for instance, need to scale up prevention efforts, particularly in the effort to reach the SDG2030 target of eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls. Businesses also have a role to play, that they too can invest in prevention of violence against women and girls, and for those that have begun to do this, to expand those efforts further. And all stakeholders, and that includes the university sector as well, they need to strengthen their internal systems to ensure provision of support to those who are experiencing violence against women and girls. In addition, we advocate that more research is also required to ensure that the evidence base for the actions taken is there. And some of this research that needs to happen includes establishing what are the long-term impacts of violence on the intergenerational capabilities. We need to know a little bit more about the impact of violence on economic growth, especially as women's labour force participation continues to rise. We also need to explore the ways in which social costs, such as those that I discussed, actually translate into economic costs over time. And to address these research gaps, what we really need is investment in longitudinal databases on violence. So just before we move on to the next part of our presentation, I just wanted to also note that, as with all research projects, is that there are many different groups of people involved. And so we do want to just kind of point towards some of these other organizations that we have worked with. So at the University of Limerick, SPDC in Pakistan, ISERT at the University of Ghana, International Centre for Research on Women, and Ipsos Mori, who have all contributed towards this project. So thank you.
Lindsay Block was unfortunately not able to come in person to this event. She's joining us by Zoom. Lindsay is working with Primark in UK, and she's the ethical trade controller and has been very active in the efforts of businesses to address gender-based violence against women and girls.
Hello.
Hello. Hello, Lindsay? Your audio.
She may not have unmuted her mic on that side. Send her a quick message. This worked okay when you tried it yesterday.
Join ID.
No, but you see, I don't want to send audio from here. We want her to send audio to us.
Hello? Okay.
Yes.
Hear me? Great.
Okay.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. If you stop being able to hear or see, then maybe just wave your arms around in front of the screen there. And yeah, so I'm sorry for the disruption, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't join you all. I was really
Join ID.
No, but you see, I don't want to send audio from here.
So shall I carry on? You can hear?
Yeah.
Hello? Okay. Oh, can you hear me? Great.
Okay.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. Sorry.
Still there?
Yeah, I am still there.
Okay. Yeah, no, keep going.
Right. Okay. So I'm Lindsay, and yeah, I work for Primark in the ethical trade team, based in the UK, but a lot of my work is overseas. and I was previously an economist with DFID for 10 years. So quick intro to Primark. Many of you will know Primark as Pennies in Ireland. Started in 1969, just had our 50th anniversary, employing nearly 80,000 people across 365 stores, and we currently sell into 12 markets. We source from around 28 markets, and we have over 1,000 supply factories in our supply chain. So just to introduce you to how we are looking at and trying to address the issue of kind of what I term gender-based violence in the supply chain. Primark, like pretty much all high street retailers, has a code of conduct. This is based on internationally recognized standards, so ILO conventions, etc. We audit all our sites, so all our factories, none of them, again, like most high street brands, we don't own our factories, but in order for them to be able to produce and supply us with goods that we will sell, we do an audit against our code of conduct. And I've just kind of picked out what I think are the three key areas of the code of conduct that relate to gender-based violence. So no discrimination is practiced, no harsh or humane treatment allowed, and obviously legal requirements in each country. So for example, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan all have legislation about workplaces needing sexual harassment committees, etc. However, we know and acknowledge that gender-based violence, as we've been talking about today, is a global issue. It affects all parts of the economy and society, and the garment sector is not immune to that. So I've just put up here a few snippets of the reporting we've seen. All these are from 2018, 2019, reports from UKAID, the IFC, Reuters, The Economist, about sexual harassment being present in the garment industry. We've got here Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, India, etc. So how do we kind of try and address this and build safe and respectful workplaces? And I think the key thing here is, again, we don't own these factories. These aren't our employees. So it's very much about working with factories to help them build their capacity. So we've got a factory here. What we're trying to do is help them to better prevent and address sexual harassment, gender-based violence. And these, through reading kind of through the evidence that we could find, is a bit of a summary of what a factory really needs to have in place. And I think the key thing here, it's an organizational approach. It's a systems type issue, and it's very, very hard just to do one thing and expect good outcomes, but it's also very difficult to do everything at the same time. But you need obviously a policy framework in the factory, but really important is also the leadership of the factory. Again, just parallels with the organizations where we work. You know, the leadership is really important. Then we've got obviously the workplace culture, and being able to identify and manage risks. So for example, migrant female workers might be more at risk than non-migrants. So it's understanding those kind of dynamics. Then obviously it's worker awareness. So there are lots of issues in the countries where we work, where workers don't necessarily understand harassment in the same way that we do. So there's a lot of awareness raising we need to do, and trust in agency. So that on the left there, you'll see grievance mechanisms. It's, you know, a grievance mechanism on its own just doesn't work unless, you know, workers have trust and agency, confidence to use that grievance mechanism. So trust that there'll be no retaliation, trust that it will be confidential, trust that the management will actually do something with the information that's given to them. So really complicated systems to actually get right in the factory. And then of course you've got society. Factories don't operate in a vacuum, and some of the key influences of society. So we've got social norms and behaviours impacting on workplace culture. We've got national and international regulations and policy impacting on the policy framework in the factory. And we've got third-party support impacting on grievance mechanisms, because one of the challenges is often finding, you know, the right external partners that can be kind of referral agents in a grievance mechanism that is specifically looking at gender-based violence issues. So that's kind of our model, if you like. Few success factors that we've seen both in operation in our factories, but also in the literature. like I said, the whole of organisation approach, an engaged and committed leadership, and broader efforts to shift social norms. And then some of the challenges are, we know that gender-based violence in some countries is a real risk for female workers during their daily commute to and from the factory. So how do we work on that? And that obviously involves lots of collaboration with other players as well, because we don't have any direct leverage over transportation in places like Dhaka or wherever workers are. As I mentioned before, addressing multiple interventions at once is very challenging, finding the right local partners, and obviously change takes time. We're talking about changing, societal views, attitudes and norms, and that takes time. So I'm just going to mention a few of the activities that Primark is undertaking to try and kind of play our part and help with the addressing these issues. So last year we partnered with Business Fights Poverty along with the IFC and I've forgotten the name, another company. Anyway, you can go on their website and have a look at this report. But basically it was a 9-month challenge, and the idea was to draw together experts to try and look at the evidence of what does actually work. And you can see there on the screen, they kind of came up with a framework of 5 points, which we're now trying to unpack and look at how we can actually practically apply that to our approach. And then I'll just really quickly mention 2 country initiatives that we're working on. So the first one is a partnership with Care International, the NGO, who I'm sure all of you have heard of. They have a program called the STOP program that was initially developed with funding from the Australian government. We're now partnering with them in, I think, about 12 of our factories. We've just started it in Vietnam and Cambodia, and it's a fantastic project that's very comprehensive. So it goes in there and helps factories set up the right policies, set up grievance mechanisms. They've got a great set of multimedia materials that are kind of this cartoon female worker, and it was about her journey and what she experiences. So there's training for factory management, training for factory workers, male, female, trained in different sessions, etc. So that's a good project that we hope to see some impact from. And the second one I'll talk about briefly is a Primark own initiative that we developed ourselves. It's called MySpace. We run it in India in partnership with the Department of Community Health from St. John's Medical College, who are based in Bangalore. This is actually a project that provides basic counselling services to workers in factories. You can see there on the left, those are a bunch of women who work in factories who generally have jobs like hostel warden, or they might be HR, but some of them are also production. They've been trained to provide basic counselling services to workers. On the right, you can see that's one of the awareness raising sessions. So obviously mental health is also, there's a lot of stigma in many of our sourcing countries. So it's encouraging workers to understand and use the counselling service. We found that sexual harassment is an issue that comes up, and we've started to introduce training. So counsellors are getting specific training on how to talk to workers about these issues, how to help people understand what is and isn't appropriate. And again, encouraging them to use the ICC, which are committees required by law in India to report sexual harassment. So what we've really learned with this project is it really takes time. You have to build these relationships, build the trust, but you can get the right mechanisms in place. And then just to finish, talking about some of the drivers of change for companies to do this work, obviously we have a very strong ethical trade program. And as I said at the beginning, we have our code of conduct based on international standards, and prevention of gender-based violence is very well embedded in that. But we've also got more and more focus on this area. So one example I thought I'd share, because it's really new. Science going to be published for the first scene in terms of corporate reporting on gender issues. And at the moment it's in draft, but there are 2 indicators down there which kind of, show how the focus on on this issue is increasing. So Primark, by the end of the year, Primark would have, publicly reported on those two indicators. So that's really it. It's a bit quick, and I'm really, really sorry I can't join you, but I hope that's been useful.
Thank you.
Lindsay, I hope you can hang on for a few more minutes. We have Katrina Gleeson from Safe Ireland will be speaking, and then we'll have a short Q&A.
Yeah, fantastic. I think I put myself back on mute, and I'm going to follow you back on YouTube.
Okay, fantastic.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Katrina, thank you.
Done.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay, yeah? So I hope you've been able to take in a lot of what's been said tonight. I'm working with Safe Ireland, and in my professional capacity, I've been working to address gender-based violence for over 20 years now, and I'm just 45, so it's been a significant part of my daily living. And I was just listening to all that's been presented, and I think the evidence base that's been gathered in this project over the last 5 years is to be commended. I'm also very envious of it, because if we had such an evidence base in Ireland, we'd be further ahead than we are at the moment. So there's a few things that I want to kind of sweep from the talk this evening. First of all, to acknowledge we've been working with Nata and Caroline particularly for the last number of years to do a very small study in Ireland. So the data, the 2.5 million cost in Ireland is based on, is it 50 women? 51, 52 women in Ireland. So just it's not the overall cost of violence in Ireland. And even to get that study done in Ireland, to pull the euros together to make it happen has been a huge battle, because we have a very significant inertia here in our infrastructure. Unfortunately, despite at least 40 years of a movement, particularly a movement of women's domestic violence services right around Ireland and other feminist activity, we have not managed to make the inroads that we should have made. So in Safe Ireland, I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with us, but we're working with the network of domestic violence services around Ireland with an ambitious vision to make Ireland one of the safest countries in the world for women and children, and then hence for all. We share a dream that one day we'll imagine we'll realise a society where we're raising a generation, at least the first generation, without violence. And I suppose the word inevitability is what's been ruminating in my head as I've looked at the data again and considered even the last few weeks of work. And I'm thinking about inevitability. I myself come from, as I'm sure many people in this room, and I know thousands of people in Ireland, come from a long line of women in our family who've all, at some level, experienced sexual violence and other forms of violence by men, and usually men intimate to us in our family circle. And I remember speaking about that publicly for the first time about 4 years ago, and the stigma that broke within our sector even, to name sexual violence within the family. Something that the profession within domestic violence, sexual violence workers had gone silenced on, because as Stacey alluded to earlier on, the stigma that's attached to speaking out, and the stigma that's very live, and I can tell from the people I work with still, consequences for me after speaking out were felt fairly soon afterwards. I remember sitting in a meeting with a minister who had shared the panel with me, and her advisor was sitting opposite. And I was in challenging a very ineffective and potentially dangerous government campaign. And in the meeting, the advisor actually turned away from me to change the person they were talking to, because she thought I was traumatized. And she actually said, you know, I've worked around child sexual violence. And I remember being quite struck by that. It didn't stop me in the meeting, and thankfully I had enough confidence and I've had enough opportunity for trauma recovery and and, you know, education and privilege, that I was able to see that for what it was. But I know that there's thousands more that wouldn't necessarily have been able to hold that position because of so many other barriers. So the inevitability I want to talk about, a few months ago I was supporting a friend who was quite upset, and I was expecting it to be that she was upset because a friend of hers had just disclosed intimate partner violence. And when you work in the field, you are actually, in your social world as well, more likely to have people coming forward, which is always an important skill to have. And in this space, this is a friend who too had experienced sexual violence within the family circle as a child. So very active feminist, somebody who has put a lot of efforts in her family and social circles to raise awareness. And the moment when she shared with me that it was her daughter who had now disclosed sexual violence was a moment that we both embraced pre-COVID and cried and experienced incredible heartbreak. But also we were able to get to the space of hope because the daughter was able to disclose and able to disclose at a young age. So unfortunately, violence against women is inevitable. Violence against girls is inevitable. Violence against boys and abuse of boys is inevitable in our society. And of course, we know violence against men is inevitable. But in the gendered context, this is something that is happening. This child was 8 when it happened. This is something that's happening on a daily basis in our society, in our homes in Ireland, and we can see in the global picture. And what we've been doing hasn't been addressing the issue. We have not even been dealing with Band-Aid. Our network of services is a very fragile network in terms of its sustainability, services that do incredible work, that on a daily basis respond to over 1,000 women and children in Ireland. So today, 1,000 women and children have received some level of support from a domestic violence service in Ireland. And these are the women that are coming forward who are in an incredible space of crisis where there's imminent danger or where there's ongoing violence, and they've no other choice but to actually come forward and seek help. And while we have seen some progress in the last 5 years, and most significantly 2 years ago, the introduction of the criminal offence of coercive control in Ireland, which I'm very proud to have been a part of the leadership role of seeing that over the line in Ireland. And that took an awful lot of passion and collaboration across many agencies, state and non-state agencies, with people who had passion and who really wanted to make a difference. And we came together and this happened. So Ireland is leading the way in this in terms of legislation. And this is a piece of, if you're not familiar with it, it's a coercive control, which is the umbrella a catch-all of what domestic abuse actually is. So it's the deliberate entrapment of usually a woman, it can be men as well, but usually a woman, instilling fear that is determined to actually reduce the capacity of a woman to be in the world. So making her world smaller. And it's a very deliberate pattern of behaviour to instill fear and to exert control, predominantly by the men that do it. So in Ireland, 3 weeks ago, we saw the first criminal conviction in Donegal, which is fantastic after just a year and a half of the legislation that the Guards and the DPP have been active in investigation and prosecution. We set about achieving the legislation for 2 reasons. One was to actually have a criminal code that would start to capture the huge failings of the justice system. But secondly, and more importantly, to set a standard in society. So to set a minimum standard of behaviour for adults, between adults, particularly in intimate relationships. So that's one step in our bigger ambition to transform and change culture in Ireland. But until we start to get up the river and look at prevention. So I think we can look at, if you get to dive in deeper into the What Works programme, you'll start to see some of the prevention pilots that were tested in the various countries. And what struck me reading that was there's so much of it is transferable to Ireland. So much of it is us thinking outside the box and thinking about how can we get into communities, how can we get into homes to start to look at changing the behaviour and changing those roots that are the drivers of the behaviour. Recently, in Safe Ireland, we got a small pocket of money that allowed, or pool of money that allowed us to do a study with behaviour and attitudes. The study, which I have a very cheaply printed version of the summary here, Gender Matters, looked at measuring attitudes in relation to decision making in the home of men and women in Ireland. So a sample of 1,000 respondents last August. The data, and just some headline data for you, because you can go look. I know you've had a lot of data today, but we looked at the decision-making roles, and this is just the attitudinal part. And I suppose we would have expected the results to be quite low, because people they were face-to-face, but they were getting to tick rather than actually having to dig deeper. Anyway, when we asked the question, should it be a man or a woman, or men, or it doesn't matter, man or woman, when it's down to being a man or a woman, to be head of household, the driver of the car, responsible for the financial control in the household, responsible for the care, responsible for household duties, driving the car. Head of household, young men in Ireland and older men in Ireland, 29% felt that it should always be a man, and this was in the attitudinal survey. Circa 20% felt that the man should always be in control of the finances. These numbers went further up with demographics. Driving the car kind of still, nearly 20% of men believe that it should always be the man driving the car. Now, I was reared in the wonderful patriarchy of Ireland, and I have a beautiful father, and about a year ago we nicknamed him Satnav Tom, because driving the car, he's still disturbed that his daughters are driving around. But so, and with love and respect to Dad, you know, there's an ingrained there, and these are the roots. So it's not to berate us all. We would have expected maybe these results 30 years ago. We'd have thought maybe these were good. Now, 2020, these aren't satisfactory results. And of course, you can go into the study, but you'll see in terms of who should be responsible for the care work, who should be responsible for household duties. Of course, the majority expected that to be women. What was most worrying in the results was the demographic. So you'd have expected over 55, my dad included, etc., to be the predominant hard end of the attitudes. But unfortunately, they weren't alone. So the demographic of 18 to 25 showed up equally, if not higher at times, in terms of holding these attitudes. And this is where we have to understand more. So we did some focus groups. We did the focus groups in Galway with students, female-only group and male-only group. And then we did a focus group in Castlebar with a male-only group, non-college, and we did 2 focus groups with parents. And what came out in the focus groups was even more disturbing. So the prevalence of lad culture and the putting down and the constant berating of women, particularly younger women, was a dominant theme, with women talking about how it affects their mobility, their daily interaction, their concept of social engagement. The younger men in Castlebar, the facilitator actually had to manage the bravado and the absolute, I suppose, disgusting. He said it took him, it's a while since he felt he had to hold back actually using foul language in the group, that it was very disturbing. And what was quite interesting in that group that happened was the young men who actually were very positive around equality and had quite diverse expressions of their humanness, were equally bullied in the group, to use the word bully. So anyway, I could go on forever, as you know. This is only a preliminary study, and attitudinal studies are only going to scratch the surface of something, but it did open up start important conversations, lots of research to be done. But why we're doing it is because we want to be upriver. So we've 5 key areas that we're asking the government to really take on at the moment in terms of Ireland having any chance of being remotely near meeting the SDGs by 2030. I probably, if you met at 2030, you might think there's some hope, but there is potential. We're a very small country. We have the capacity to demonstrate huge social change in a short period of time. We have a strong evidence base of that. And what we in Safe Ireland really believe is that where all of us as collaborators in the academic space, in the social space, in the state space, are working together and pooling resources, that we actually can model something in Ireland that can be of benefit to the rest of the world. So on that note, I'm going to leave you. Safe Ireland's website has a lot of research reports that might inform your current studies, and we're always open to particularly PhD ideas coming forward and working to support any research that can be developed, and continue to look forward to working with Nata and the crew here. Okay, thank you.
I know it's been a lot of information that has been thrown at you throughout the last hour and a half. We can have a short Q&A. And then there is a reception outside. So any questions? Can you get Lindsay back on? She's watching on YouTube.
Yeah, that's what you'd said. So.
Okay. Well, if we have a particular question for Lindsay, we'll give a shout out to her.
Be louder now. Yeah, hi. My name's Lavina, and I work with Kildare Youth Service, so I came up from Newbridge today, particularly for this. I'm interested in, I went to Nairobi with the National Youth Council of Ireland to the Nairobi Summit, and it was there where Ireland kind of made, commitment to the zero violence against women. But it's just when you're talking about the intergenerational trauma, it kind of just brought me back to some of the work that we do. So I would have been working a lot with young women around violence, and I do feel that it's starting like a lot younger. So I would work with 12 to 24. But when I was in Nairobi, they spoke really highly about how it's young people that we need to start it, and that's where the at the grassroots level. But when I came back on Monday morning, it was kind of forgotten about, and it's like the funding isn't there to do those projects within the youth service, because we're trying to do other projects that aren't actually linked to that. So I'm wondering if there is to put towards policy, are they if they want to make this by 2030, are they actually going to provide funding for the young people to start off? Is there any talk of that? Because if they're saying the young people are the way forward, and we are working with the young people in the projects, but the funding is not there to talk about sexual violence or violence in the home, but yet we are actually picking up the pieces, like this intergenerational trauma that is happening with young people, and it's separated to this big massive, ordeal that's actually happening for them. So it'd be good if anybody would have any ideas of kind of where I go from this, because I'm in an organisation which is fantastic, and being in Nairobi was amazing, and I also went to actually Lebanon as well, and they were working on different projects where they're educating young boys, and there's no projects like that in Ireland. So does anybody want to start a project with me? Because it's frustrating, so if anyone would have any ideas of how I would go about starting a project.
Well, I think on top of my head, it would be interesting to have a longer conversation with you to see whether in the university we do have community outreach, we have certain funding for community initiatives, to see if something could be developed. Obviously on campus, there's great interest that we need to be working with young people, particularly students here, and that could be a starting point for developing some models. It is true that there is very little learning from the global south to the global north, and I think this is something that has to change. because in the Global South, where communities are still such an important institution, there are many different kinds of interventions that are being tested. And that has to be brought back into the Global North. So even the Center for Global Women Studies would be interested to talk about what are the ways we could move this type of agenda. Because as you say, to really achieve, and as Katrina said, to really achieve this 2030 goal, the efforts that we need to do are multiple and need to be at some sort of scale in Ireland to actually, and Ireland has the potential to reach the 2030 goal, just because it is a small country. And so that itself, if we could develop a consortium to say, let us do some interventions to see what effect we can have, would be something really a fantastic outcome of this meeting. Why don't I invite all the speakers to sit here so that people can ask you directly questions.
Yeah, can you make a comment on that as well?
Working here, is it? Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm sorry, are you with Chuck Charman, is it, did you say, in Kildare? Okay. Safe Ireland hosted this summit about 18 months ago, and Spun Out partnered with us in it, and the wealth and impact of the summit was because of the engagement of young people in it, and the insights and the learning. And I think it's that combination of so much is happening in the developing South that we can draw on here, and then there's not the same complications within the younger population that us elders seem to carry with us. But it is critical to Safe Ireland that the youth of today are driving the change in Ireland, and we're trying to explore ways. So we're very happy to link in with you as well.
They should be 15, well knowing what way they need to be respected, and I'm trying to finish now. So before they get to that stage.
Yeah, and in our education system, there's been some improvements in the curriculum, but we're way behind in terms of like how gendered the world has become. I was thinking there recently, I remember the freedom of being able to wear whatever I wanted when I was a kid. My parents, were no different to most parents in Ireland at the time, but I wasn't kind of molded into this is what girls wear and this is what boys wear. Whereas it's become much more pronounced now in terms of, like, I remember my 3-year-old going into play school and just being stunned by how quickly the world became pink and blue and boys and girls. And it's incredibly disturbing, and as a parent, and with my partner, we're both women, so we've been quite interested in how the stereotyping has crept into with both our daughters over the years, despite the fact that they have 2 mothers, 2 women parenting them. And so, don't get me wrong, the battles around who does the washing up are no different, but it's not delineated as male or female, and so there's something quite deep in the psyche that we have got to get in at. I think if we take our eye off the gender norms, which we've done, I think, over the years, we're going to make no progress. And I think the other areas you touched on is the intergenerational trauma. So I haven't had to have had the experience of sexual violence myself to be affected by the trauma of the generations before me. And like from the field of epigenetics now, you can see that trauma is actually inherited, but also in terms of how we've assimilated the effects on our parents or our grandparents, that plays out in the world. So there's a huge body of work, but if we're going to only firefight at the refuge door, which is critical, for those coming forward, we're going to go nowhere. So, you know, the upriver work is where we have to start putting investment, and there's little or none of that in Ireland at the moment.
The idea just came from, I was at the Irish Family Planning Association had an event last week, and I was speaking at it around my experiences of after being in Nairobi. But I was talking with a woman, she was working in, I think she was part of the Oireachtas. She was part of the Oireachtas, and after my speech she come up to me and she goes, "Oh, that's really, really good, like work you're doing with youth service." She was like, "Do you have like your own project on SRHR?" And I was like, no, we really don't. I was like, we would be lucky to run programs maybe with one group like a term, because we all, you know, are like we're pretty busy like in doing other stuff. And then it just actually got me thinking, there actually isn't any projects, you know, for that, because you'd have like teen parent support programs, you'd have, you know, coder dojos, but you don't really have anything on SRHR. So it just kind of got me thinking, like, we really, there's a gap there. And then, you know, if we have workers to do the job, then, you know, it'd be good.
So thank you very much for this, for all the talks and for this really important pieces of research, really painful, I suppose, as well. I wanted to propose a question that was prompted by actually Lindsay's presentation. She had in one of the slides the importance of finding the I think it was something like the right local partner. And then my question to her relates to if they are reaching out to feminist local groups and how is that working. And then it rolls out to all of you as well in terms of your understanding with the relationship with different women's organizations and feminist groups. It's probably not tackled by the surveys themselves, but I wonder if in the qualitative research, if it came out that that would also be, I think I made my question, but how much feminism, mobilizations, sociabilities would also have something important in terms of challenging violence against women and girls. So, yeah.
All right, so I think in terms of the research that we did as part of the DFID project and women's engagement in different kinds of, you know, feminist or women's organizations, is that, you know, we had built into our surveys questions about people's engagement or participation in different kinds of groups. And one of the things that we did want to see was, you know, the extent to which that might influence, you know, whether, you know, help seeking, whether it might influence rates of violence, those kinds of things. But when it came to participation, we actually found very, very low rates of participation in any kind of community groups within our study sample. And so we couldn't really make those kinds of links there, but it's something that we would want to explore to a greater extent. Now, what we did do, though, within our project is that we had national advisory boards in each of the 3 countries that we worked in. And so within those national advisory boards, we invited various kinds of stakeholders, and that included civil society organizations and women's organizations. So what we saw them as being really important partners, both because they can give us a kind of feedback that we may not be able to get ourselves directly from surveys, in terms of them talking to us about, you know, how they perceived our findings, right, and how they might interpret them on the ground. But that also they're important partners in terms of bringing the findings forward, right? So our work provides evidence, but we need people to take that evidence and do something with it. And we produce it with the hope that they'll see this as being incentive that they can then bring to governments and say, look at what this is costing you. It will cost you less to invest in it and resolve the issue. And so in that sense, then those kinds of feminist and women's organizations and civil society organizations in general are hugely important to kind of the broader objectives of this kind of work.
Yeah, and sort of, for example, in Ghana, where we had the evidence was used by women's groups to actually press the president of Ghana to have systematic contribution to the Domestic Violence Fund and to increase the level of funding to that Domestic Violence Fund. And women's groups felt that this evidence, which they initially had said, why do you want to do costing? Violence is a human rights violation, and that should be the only logic that should force governments to engage in activities, then found that this evidence was really useful to say, look, you're losing this much. And so increasing the scale of investment is in fact smart investment. And as Dr. Raghavendra said, investment, if we take this loss or cost and turn it into an investment argument, we're not making a utilitarian. We're just saying that this is actually the potential benefit that societies can get. And women's groups do use that evidence.
Not from this project, but I can go back to past about 25 years ago, 1993. I can talk about one experience that I had with Nata in India at the time. In a southern state, Andhra Pradesh, there was this anti-liquor movement that was going on at the time. Women's groups were leading that movement. And every time women's group spoke to the district collector and the administration, they basically argued that, look, if we ban alcohol, we are losing this much amount of money to the exchequer. Will you give that money to us? Then we'll ban alcohol. So women's organization had no argument to make to that, counter-argument to make to that logic. So they were kind of, they came to us, not us, but and we started to think about the other way. We said, well, it is a cost that you lose for the exchequer, but because of liquor, you have violence, and that violence creates productivity losses. So if you actually calculate, the cost versus benefit, then, so we posed this argument to the women groups who felt empowered at the time. Every time a women's group go to the collector, the goalpost was shifting from the administration. So you say, it's a cost argument, then they'll say, no, it's a human rights issue. So this is one way that we develop to argue from within the premises of their own logic. That is quite important for me as a as a researcher and as a citizen of any community, that it is essential to make this point that you cannot simply detach economy and say, I only talk about economy. That's something that I thought that was very inspiring for me at the time. I continued to work in this area to kind of show that you can work within the logic, which is what dominates right now, economic logic, fiscal space, and so on and so forth. That's where this funding issue, ultimately will land in the table of finance minister who will talk about, we don't have money to fund this.
Hello. Can I just say my name is Tom, my colleague here is Mary, and we're with the organisation Victim Assistance. So we support victims of crime right throughout the whole country, and indeed, if you're a victim of crime, then you have an awful lot of trauma in your life also. And we would come across every single week women all over the country who have been affected by that type of violence in the house and the different crime that's associated with the different situations that they find themselves caught up in. But what we find is that there will be so many more women coming forward but there's a huge fear factor out there. There's the fear factor of the unknown. How do I go about addressing my situation? And I have to acknowledge the wonderful work that's been done by Safe Ireland. It's fantastic, and the aspirations are even bigger, and hopefully it will come to suffice in time. But there are so many women out there that, number one, they have a total lack of trust in the criminal justice system, and sometimes they don't even know where to start about telling their story. And I suppose the one great thing that we can offer them is that listening ear, that ability to sit down and get them to tell their story and advance it on further. Indeed, we have had occasion to refer on to Safe Ireland and to quite a very good and satisfactory conclusion. So it's the total unknown charted waters that women just don't even know how to go about addressing the situation. And we've come across some terrible situations in the last number of years. Women that are totally trapped in an environment that is totally and absolutely vicious and desperate. And it's not just alone the women, it's the children, it's the family, and it's a whole lot of other situations as well. So just to say that it is quite enormous out there.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you for your continued work, which is quite critical. And I think you've touched on the nub of the reality for so many people on a daily basis. I think one of the things that we really understand is that the justice system is working as it was designed to work. The problem with the justice system is it was never designed to respond to women's needs. The justice system in Ireland and across the world is a product of patriarchal structures, and only maybe in the 90s were women allowed to serve in juries. Up until then, we were considered to be too emotional in Ireland to be able to hold a rational opinion. And it's actually it's very insidious, very disturbing, and there's been times when over the years, I've felt we should stop telling women to come forward, because the abuse that women are subjected to once they actually enter into the system is, I don't yet think, fully understood in Ireland. When we produced the Lawlessness of the Home in 2012, the first thing that was done was to say, well, it's only 13 women that you've interviewed. So we went back out to the services and we tested the cases we had to see, was this the extremes, or was this the typical daily reality? And of course, shockingly, it was the daily reality of the services. And I think it's touched on the question earlier on, until there's a will to actually really disrupt the gender bias and the racial bias that's embedded in particularly in our justice system, but across, and I would say equally as disturbing and as, to use the word corrupt is probably seen to be a bit dramatic, but I would say our child protection system and how it's serving to protect abusers of women and of children on a daily basis. And unfortunately, what was probably seen as an attempt when the first iteration of family law was introduced in Ireland, the in-camera system was set up and presented to protect the family, the marital situation, which I don't know if many of you realise is our constitutional basis for the privacy of the marital family is quite trumped in our constitution. But so what the in-camera, while it would have been presented, I suppose, to women coming forward as an opportunity to have privacy, what it has done is it has silenced the majority of women, many of them. We don't have a quantum of how many, but we know the numbers are growing and increasingly growing, whose identity has been silenced, whose children have been taken off them, who are being classified as mad, bad, incapable, and who are very well able to manage and care for their children, women, right across Ireland, in most communities, if not all communities. So we have a ridiculously horrendous, scandalous situation in Ireland at the moment that I don't think is too different once it starts to get a more public understanding, too different to our history in terms of mother-baby homes, our history in terms of laundries, our history in terms of the institutionalisation of women. And certainly if there's any researchers that are open to start looking at this, there's a lot of voluntary people and within our own services working and unable actually to really provide solutions to these women who on a daily basis are without access to children. And that's that cohort of women, those going into the system. I did a presentation about 2 years ago, and I kind of hooked the presentation on if my sister asked me, would I refer her into the justice system if she was experiencing domestic abuse? And it's a conflict, but I haven't the confidence to do that. And despite the fact that there is laws, yeah, maybe if I knew that the local guards and the local judges and everybody else, and usually if she hasn't, depending on the profile of him, but it is an incredible journey, and it is no surprise then that we have such a low uptake of women coming forward. I think there's information there at some level in terms of how to navigate the system, but not the way you need to navigate the system. And the majority of women that we'd work with are highly intelligent, incredibly resilient, and intuitive, and know often not to take steps, or having taken steps, or have been forced into the justice system. They haven't looked to be in it. They've been forced into it by virtue of the fact that those who are abusing them are very enabled in society. And there's no boundary on class or education or income here. In many of the instances of women coming forward to us, the more money they have, the worse off they are, because the more likely they're going to be screwed right up to the High Court until they're bled dry. Some of the data coming through, we'll see that women are more educated than those that are abusing them, but they're more likely to be leading into poverty quite quickly because of the abuse. And we could do a whole day here. So I think, Tom, I didn't touch on it here because we'd had a lot covered, but and I see Mary Louise here as well. So this is information that's not yet in the public domain, but we're trying to find ways to make that happen.
That I'm not mad or bad. It's about 18 years ago, I'd say maybe 100, 200 meters from here, that I made a decision to get involved with somebody that I had no idea the consequences that would have on me, my family, and my entire life. But I have so much hope, and Katrina said everything. I've spent 170 days of my life in court. So far this year, district, circuit, High Court, district again next week. So that's been going on for the last 12 years. One child in common who will be 13 in June. So the idea, you were talking about how it causes isolation, and that social exclusion, absolutely. I had a fantastic education. I don't really talk to that many people that I would have grown up around, the people I hung out with as a teenager. My experience is too unsettling, or I'd say there's probably far too many very nervous men actually right now after the wonderful sentencing of Harvey Weinstein today, that do not want to see the consequences of their behaviour. Certainly not in someone in their close circles who might be considered a friend, and it has taken me years of going to Safe Ireland summits and going to every kind of event I can and educating myself and looking for ways. I've always been quite a problem solver. It was my role in the family growing up, and it seems to me that by giving women their voice and not empowering them to be, survivors, but actually bringing survivors with lived experience into the domain of becoming trainers and leaders and developing that capacity, and by sending them out into the community together, not in isolation, together, where they understand one another and can share that experience, a little bit like what you were talking about, Katrina, you know, when you said that you were in the presence of somebody who was trying to dismiss you because of your experience, but you were able to, you know, to deal with that by the company. It's so important that that acknowledgement is there and not used as a way to hold someone back, but that it is actually something to drive each other forwards. So I'm the founder of a new organization called CC, Survivors Informing Services and Institutions. And our mission is to obviously gather survivors, to raise awareness, to increase capacity, develop leadership skills, mentorship through training and development, to bring that out into corporations, into services. I think we should have panels of women survivors with lived experience going into every corporation, every educational institution across the country, and sharing what has happened and teaching about those nuances that can be missed. You know, you talked about that with the data. It can be so hard to get a broad spectrum of experience in a small survey, and as of yet we don't have the investment here. I'd like to reinvest whatever income potentially comes from that back into the you know, the perpetuation of that. Women can graduate, move on. There will always be more survivors. But I think it is a huge response that's needed if we are to reach that goal of 2030. It's enormous. And the more that, you know, we link in with one another, support each other. Safe Ireland gave me, I think, €400 2 years ago to bring together a group of survivors to a camp in West Cork. And now we have an advisory group. We have women who want to participate, who are ready to take up leadership roles. It's incredible what's been achieved with a very small budget. When people's well-being, social inclusion, livelihoods, and their children's futures are on the line, women are so incredibly resourceful. Imagine what we could do if that was invested in, you know? So we're willing to work with anybody who wants to hear, and an independent resource for data as well, sorry, is what we want to do. And that's the first time I've said all of that in the one space, so thank you.
I think that's extremely inspiring, and this is one of the reasons to hold these kinds of events, is to show the possibilities of what data can do, as well as then find new ways and new partnerships to keep continuing to build this evidence. Because without the evidence, we're not going to get a change. And so that's something that I hope that today's session has provided you with some evidence that will lead to new kinds of actions. I think we've continued for quite some time, so I'd like to invite everyone out for a reception. And I just wanted to say a word of thanks to Gillian Brown, who's not here, but she was the force behind organizing this entire event, and without her it would not have been possible. So thank you very much.